later on that evening, we went out to the coop. All the hens are up on the roost. And he turned around and he very dramatically says, ladies, you need to enjoy your last few days on earth. On Thursday, you're going to die. This is for real. This ain't the movies. At that point, I realized he understood the concept of death. He understood the concept that these animals were going to become food, and it was all good. This is the Homestead Journey Podcast, the podcast dedicated to the pursuit of self-sufficiency, self-reliance, and sustainability. This is episode number 122 of the Homestead Journey Podcast. Welcome, 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 everyone. My name is Brian Wells. I am coming to you from 3B Farm and Homestead here in beautiful upstate New York. On today's episode, we are going to be continuing our series on raising kids on the homestead and the lessons that I believe can be learned by, growing up on a homestead. Today's topic is a bit more of a serious one. We are going to be talking about lessons in death and loss. And my fear is that this may end up being the least downloaded episode in the history of this podcast because, as a culture, I think we have a tendency to avoid the topic of death and loss. And so I know it's a huge risk to cover this topic, but I also believe it's a very important topic to cover. And so we're going to do that. But before we do so, it is spring here in beautiful upstate New York. At least I think it is. It's been a busy, busy week here on the homestead. We've had some exciting things happen. We've had some tragic things happen. And so let's jump on over to this week's Homestead Happenings, and I'll bring you up to speed with what we've been doing. As I mentioned on last week's episode, I had a bit of an issue getting started with my transplants. I had hoped to get some onions started last weekend, and due to circumstances beyond my control, that didn't quite happen. But I did get my onions in the dirt this week, and they're already starting to pop up. In fact, if you follow us on social media, you'll have seen, I get excited about it and probably nobody else cares. But I did share some pictures this week of those little sprouts poking up out of the ground. Always very exciting to see that. I also was able to get some peppers started this week. I was able to get tomatoes and some herbs started as well. And in fact, if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll notice that it's a lot brighter over here than it normally is. And that's because that's where my seed starting system is. And it's almost full already. I've got one more rack on the bottom that doesn't have anything on it. Hopefully this week I'll get that filled up and we'll be well underway for Garden 2022 here on the homestead. So very excited about that. This week, I also was able to finish up the rough plan of my garden and finally get my seeds ordered. In fact, that was the topic of this week's blog post. So if you missed that, thehomesteadjourney.net/blog. And I shared with you that already I have started my garden notes for 2022 because I'm trying to learn some lessons from my procrastination. So head on over to thehomesteadjourney.net/blog to see that. But as I said, I was able to get my rough plan semi-completed. I'll probably add a few more things to it. But what my rough plan is it's simply a list of the things that I want to grow this year. And then I will sit down. I use growveg.com, and I will use that to actually put together a detailed plan with exactly where I'm going to place those plants that I hope to grow this year in the garden. But at least my rough plan is done and my seeds are ordered. But that did mean that the seeds that I used to start things indoors, I had to rely on the seeds I already had on hand, or I had to go buy them from my local garden center, Tractor Supply, hardware stores, etc. Not that there's anything wrong with those seeds, but the downside to buying those seeds is that they are more expensive and you have a lack of variety. So next year, I've got to get my butt in gear, get my seed order in sooner, but thankfully I had plenty of seeds on hand. And so very glad to have all of that done. And I don't feel quite as behind as I did last weekend. This weekend, we also had something very exciting happen, and that is that we had piglets born here on the homestead. That's always very exciting. I shared on Instagram and Facebook some videos and some pictures of those piglets. So check that out if you missed that. Always very, very exciting to have that happen. The first litter, unfortunately, was born at the most inopportune time. I shouldn't say the most inopportune time, but it was a very inopportune time. I believe I've mentioned on the podcast that Brian Jr. has been participating in mock trial through the school. And Tuesday night, he had another mock trial competition that I was going to attend. I was very excited about it. Came home from work, went to feed the pigs, trying to do that as quick as possible so that we could jump in the car and head to the competition. I saw that one of the sows had farrowed. I couldn't just leave them because I have 3 sows in that pen together and I register the pigs. So I need to know which piglets belong to which sow. And the way I do that, as I've shared before, is through ear notching. And so I knew that I had to notch those ears right then and there. And it was the quickest, I believe, I've ever done that. I grabbed my coveralls, threw those on, jumped over the fence, gently placed the piglets in a tote, pulled them out. Bonnie held them out away from her body so she didn't get blood on her clothes. I went ahead and notched them very quickly, put them back in the tote, jumped over the fence, put them back in the pen, and we hauled tail to mock trial and actually got there on time, but not with much time to spare. So that was very exciting. And then on Wednesday, I believe, Wednesday or Thursday, the other sow farrowed, and we had a total of 11 between the 2 pigs. We had a total of 11 piglets born live. There were 2 that were stillborn. But unfortunately, I don't know what's taken place this year, but we are down currently to 5 piglets alive. I don't know if the sows are falling on them. It did get a little chillier this week than it normally has in the past. So maybe they got chilled. I don't know, but I'm very, very frustrated, very disappointed. And so as we talk about death and loss today, I will be reminding myself that this is a part of homesteading. As my buddy Dave says, when you have livestock, eventually you'll have dead stock. So you have to prepare yourself for that. But I'm not really quite sure if there's something different I need to do. If I've done something wrong, if the pigs have done something wrong, I'm a little bit at a loss right now. We have not experienced this level of loss over 50%, right? And that frustrates me greatly. So I'm already in the back of my mind thinking about maybe some tweaks that I'm going to make next year to infrastructure. It's a bummer, but it is exciting to have baby pigs here on the homestead, and the other sow is due to farrow early next week. So we'll see if she lasts that long. She's definitely getting around, so it shouldn't be long. This week, I also moved our mobile chicken coop down from the Ruth Stout bed to the driveway near the garage. We have chicks on the way, and so I needed to get that down closer to the house. But one of the things I needed to do was to repair the window. I had put some glass in it last week, and that glass was a little bit of a different size than what the window called for. And so yesterday, my plan was to take a few boards, frame it in a little bit, and just go with it. As I did so, I wanted to make sure that I had the boards fairly tightly together inside and outside so that the glass didn't wiggle too much in the wind and then end up breaking. Unfortunately, knucklehead me got the boards too close and I shattered the glass. And so my backup plan was I'm just going to cut a board that will fit in the window. And then as things warm up and the chickens feather out, I'll take that board out. I'll put mesh over the window and they'll have some good ventilation during the summer. I went ahead and measured the window. I started to make the first cut and I was using my DeWalt battery powered saw. And of course, the battery died and the other battery needed to be charged. And so I said, no big deal. I'll move on to some other things as the battery charges. And then I will cycle back to this later on in the day. Well, when I decided to come back to it, I went ahead and finished making the cut where the battery had died. And then I needed to measure the width and make a final cut. Except at that point, I could not find my tape measure. I still can't find my tape measure. I spent about a half hour of wasted time yesterday looking for that blessed tape measure. I have 3 tape measures that I know of. I couldn't find a single one. That frustrates me because I do that all the time in projects. My organizational skills definitely need to improve because I could be a lot more efficient in my projects if I wasn't constantly losing stuff or trying to remember why I had last used it or dropped it. I am just the worst at that. And that's definitely a growing edge for me. While I was looking for the tape measure, I ended up losing my phone, or so I thought. I spent about 5 minutes running around the house looking for a phone. Was it on the bed? No, it wasn't on the bed. Was it in the office? No, it wasn't in the office. Did I happen to put it on the countertop in the bathroom? Nope, I didn't. Was it on the island in the kitchen? No, it wasn't there. Was it on the dining room table? Nope, wasn't there. Was it on the sofa? Nope, it wasn't there. The entire time it was in my left hand. I spent 5 to 10 minutes looking for a phone that was in my left hand. I am losing it, folks. So between the lost tape measure and the missing phone, I wasted a lot of time yesterday. Very, very frustrating. Could have got, well, probably 35 to 40 minutes worth of more stuff done if I wasn't looking for stuff that I had lost or that I thought I had lost. Anyhow, I am very, very happy that the mobile coop is ready. I bought some shavings yesterday. We've got them in the coop ready to go when the chicks arrive next week. A couple of weeks ago, I also shared with you that I was going to experiment with starting some grapes and currants from cuttings. And so I moved ahead with that experiment this week. All I did was go out and shove them in the compost pile. We'll see if that does anything. And then my last experiment is going to use rooting hormone, dip them in that, and then put them in some pots filled with some garden soil. So we'll see if any of these work, but I do have the cuttings that are in water. Now I have the cuttings just in the compost pile, and then we will see if cuttings and root hormone in some pots with our garden soil, well, if that works. Who knows? It's all an experiment. If none of it works, no harm, no foul. It was stuff I would have just tossed anyhow. But maybe out of those 3 methods, I'll be able to get some additional fruit-bearing plants ready to go. So it's just been a very, very busy week here on the homestead. So much accomplished. Now, I also wanted to share with you that I'm almost ready to release the next Just the Basics printable guide on the topic of chickens. I wrapped that up this week. I've had people proofreading it. It's a little bit longer than the first ones that I've done, but I felt like I needed to do the topic justice. And so they are slogging through all of my mistakes and grammatical issues. And hopefully in the next couple of days, I will be releasing that. So if you have not signed up for Just the Basics printable guides, head on over to the homesteadjourney.net/basics to get signed up, and I will notify you early this coming week of the release of that particular guide. I also was able to get started on the gardening guide, and so hopefully at the end of this coming week, that one will be released. But so excited about that. A lot of people signing up for those printables. And as you do so, and as you're reading through those, if there are ways I can make them more helpful, if there are mistakes in them, please let me know. My goal is to make these as helpful as possible to people. And so check that out, thehomesteadjourney.net/basics. This week, I was also humbled and honored to be featured on Amy Dingman's podcast, A Farmish Kind of Life. And so check that out. It's on all of the major podcast players, or you can head on over to her website, afarmishkindoflife.com, and you can listen to that. That was such a fun interview, a great conversation, and I think you'll really, really enjoy that. The final thing I wanted to share with you is this past Saturday, we had our monthly call with the gold members. So that's the top tier of the supporting listeners program. And it was just absolutely a wonderful time of sharing stories, swapping ideas, learning from each other. And if that's something that's of interest to you, well, Bonnie's got some great information for you.
If you enjoy this podcast and are interested in supporting it, you can do so by becoming a member of the Supporting Listeners Program. For as little as $3 a month, you can not only support this show, but gain access to a private members-only community on Discord. There are also 2 additional tiers, one at $5 a month and one at $10 a month, each with additional benefits and perks. So head on over to the homesteadjourney.net/support for more information and to get signed up today.
All right, with all of that said, folks, let's jump on over to this week's Charting the Course. On today's episode, we are going to continue our series of raising kids on the homestead, and we're going to consider lessons in death and loss. When kids are raised on a homestead, when they grow up around animals in particular, but even to a certain extent with regards to plants and so forth, in some regards, they are forced to confront death and deal with death and loss in ways that other kids aren't. And I believe if we handle it properly, it means that they're going to have a better perspective on death, a better perspective on loss, and hopefully be able to handle it as they move through life. You see, death is a part of life. For some reason, I think culturally we try to avoid it, or when we do talk about it, we use terms like passed away or went to heaven. We really try to avoid using the word die and death. And I don't think that's always very healthy. In fact, as I was thinking this week about the fact that we have a tendency to avoid that topic, I got to thinking, Brian, it's really foolish of you to include that in the name of the episode. This is probably going to be the least downloaded episode of your podcast, but I really do strongly feel like it's a topic that we need to cover. It's something that we need to discuss and confront. And I strongly believe that when kids grow up on a homestead, if we do this right, they're going to be able to have a healthier perspective on death and an ability to process it in ways that others might not. And so as we think about death and loss on the homestead, there's really 5 things that I want us to consider. The first thing is that we should not avoid the topic. To a certain extent, having animals on the homestead forces us to deal with the topic. This week, we lost 6 piglets. That's forced us to deal with death in a way that we wouldn't have had to if we didn't have pigs here on the homestead. As I mentioned before, like my buddy Dave says, if you've got livestock, eventually you're going to have dead stock. And so you have to be able to prepare yourself for it You can't avoid the topic. And I think it's very important that we don't shield our kids from the idea of death and dying. It is a part of life. It's a part of homestead living. And so we cannot avoid it. And I think we need to make sure that our kids are a part of that conversation. The second thing I would say is it's important for us to be truthful with regards to death. If our child's pet bunny dies, we shouldn't tell them that little bunny Foo-Foo ran away. Little bunny Foo-Foo didn't run away. Little bunny Foo-Foo died. And I think it's very important. I think it's healthy for us to actually use that terminology. Didn't pass away. It didn't go to heaven. It died. I think it's very important that we lean into that word so that our kids are comfortable with the concept that death is a very real part of life and that death is a very real part of homesteading. But I also think that it's very important that we are very sensitive to our kids' emotional maturity. How we talk about death with a 4-year-old is going to be different or should be different than how we discuss death with our 14-year-old. Our 4-year-old is not going to really be able to understand all of the concepts, but we shouldn't treat our 14-year-old like they're a 4-year-old. We need to be honest with them, but we also need to be sensitive to their developmental stages, their emotional maturity, and so on and so forth. The fourth thing that I think it's important for us to do is it's important for us to give them space to grieve. This big boys don't cry nonsense is for the birds. I think some people lean into the way that they were raised or perhaps their ethnic background a little bit too much. I'm Irish. We don't cry or whatever it is. I don't know. Maybe it's Irish aren't supposed to cry, but there are some people that really lean into that. And I think that it's important that we give our kids, and not just our kids, but ourselves, room to grieve. I remember the first time that we had a pig die here on the farm from natural causes. In other words, it wasn't that I had decided that it was time to dispatch that pig and send it to freezer camp, but it just died of a disease. It actually died, we believe it died of tetanus. And I remember the emotions that I felt, the sadness that I felt, the anger that I felt, the doubt that I felt. Did I do something wrong? What could I have done differently? But it was very important for me as an adult to be able to deal with that and process that through. And I cried. It was not a good time. I felt horrible over that. Now, are you going to cry over every animal that dies on your homestead? Probably not. But is it okay to cry over animals that die? Absolutely. In fact, this week I was listening to Nicole Sauce over at Living Free in Tennessee, and she was talking about how they had processed some pigs. I don't remember if it was last weekend or the weekend before. And if you listen to her podcast, she refers to one of her neighbors. I believe he actually rents from her as Tactical. And Tactical was the one that actually was responsible for feeding the pigs. And when it came time to process those pigs, they sent Tactical away from the homestead because he has an emotional attachment to those pigs, whereby it's very difficult for him to participate in the dispatch of those pigs. Now, once the pigs have been dispatched, then he can participate in processing them. But the actual dispatch of the pigs is something that's very, very difficult for him. And so they give him space to grieve. We can do that with our kids. When Brian Jay's favorite chicken, Sweet Pea, was inadvertently sent to the auction last year, that sucked. That sucked for him. It sucked for me. It sucked for Bonnie. It was not a good situation. And I needed to allow him space to grieve that loss because I knew he loved that chicken a lot. There was no way I was going to say to him, big boys don't cry. There was no way I was going to say to him, 16-year-olds don't cry. No way. Let him grieve. No, I don't know if he cried over it or not. I don't really remember. I know he was mad. I know he was upset, but I gave him space to grieve and to work through that loss. And I think that's very important. And I think that when we're raising kids on a homestead, they, by the nature of livestock eventually becomes dead stock, they have opportunities to process, to work through grief if we give them that space in a way that is healthy and that will set them up for success later on in life. The final thing that I want to share with you is that we should not force our kids to participate in death and loss. And what I mean by that is this. I think it's important that our kids understand that if we're raising animals for meat, they're meat, and we can't let them turn everything into pets. I remember back when Brian J. first took a real interest in chickens. I can't remember how old he was. He was probably 8 or 9 years of age. At that time, the chickens were still down at my grandfather's house. Bonnie and I were down there working in the garden one afternoon, and Brian J. disappeared. And when we went and found him, he was actually in the chicken coop. He was talking to the chickens. And from that time on, he really developed this love for the chickens to the point to where he had them named. He knew each one individually. I mean, I know the difference between a Buff Orpington and a Delaware, but if we have 5 Buff Orpingtons, unless there's something drastically different about them, I just know we have 5 Buff Orpingtons. But he knew each individual Buff Orpington, and he had a name for each one: Miss Plucky, Miss Backfeathers. I don't remember all they were, but he actually went through and named every one of them, and he would pick them up and he would carry them around. And at night he would go out into the coop and he would make sure that they were all set up in a particular order. And he just fell in love with these chickens. Well, my practice with regards to raising chickens is that I dress off my flock every year. I get egg-layered chicks in the spring, and when the pullets start laying in the fall, then I dress off the hens. At that time, I was taking my chickens somewhere else to have them processed. And I had made the appointment to do that. And then I got to thinking, Brian is in love with these chickens. He's named all of these chickens. Is he going to be able to handle this situation? And so I was having doubts about it. I called my dad up and I said, Dad, what do you think? What should I do? And he said, son, he needs to understand that those are not pets. Those are food. I thought, okay, Dad, if this goes horribly wrong, it's on you. It's your fault. If he has a breakdown, I'm sending him up to your house. And so I pulled Brian J. aside and I said to him, now, bud, I want you to understand, on Thursday, we're going to be taking the chickens down over the hill and they're going to be processed. And then we're going to bring them home and they're going to be meat. And he looked at me and said, okay. I thought, does he not understand this? But I figured, okay, I've done my job as a parent. I've explained the situation to him, and it is what it is. Well, later on that evening, we went out to the coop. We were doing something, and he turned around. All the hens are up on the roost, and he very dramatically says, ladies, you need to enjoy your last few days on earth. On Thursday, you're going to die. This is for real. This ain't the movies. At that point, I realized he understood the concept of death. He understood the concept that these animals were going to become food, and it was all good. A couple years later, I started processing the chickens myself. And one of the things that I have never done is I have never asked Brian J. to take part when we butcher the hens. Now, when we do the meat birds, he will help. He'll go gather them up. He'll bring them down to us. He doesn't kill them, but once the kill has been done, he will scald them. He'll put them in the plucker. I usually do the evisceration, but he will help with that. But when it is time to do the hens, I do not force him to participate in that because I understand that he has an emotional connection with those birds, unlike what I do. And so just like with Tactical over there at Living Free in Tennessee, I give him space to grieve. I do not force him to participate in that. When it's time to do a pig, he's helped me before, not a lot, but he's helped me. He doesn't have that emotional attachment. I just don't force him to participate. I allow him to participate on whatever level he feels comfortable. And I really think that's a very, very good way to do it. Other people might disagree with me, but I think that it's just important that we give them space, especially if they do have that emotional attachment. So my 5 tips to you with regards to dealing with death on the homestead with your children. Number 1, don't avoid the topic. And quite frankly, if you have animals, I don't think you're going to be able to do so. Number 2, be truthful. Little bunny Fufu didn't run away. Little bunny Fufu didn't go over the rainbow. Little bunny Fufu died. And I think it's okay for us to use that terminology with our kids. But number 3, we need to be sensitive to our kids' emotional maturity and their development, the stage of development that they're at. How we talk to a 4-year-old about death is going to be different than how we talk to a 14-year-old about death. Number 4, give them space to grieve. Don't ever say big boys or big girls don't cry. Please don't ever say that. And number 5, don't force them to participate in butchering day if they don't feel comfortable in doing so. Hopefully you found this episode helpful. It's a tough one to talk about. It's one that I really was dreading, but I think it's something that is so very, very important to talk about. And I think it's important for us to talk about with our kids as well. If you have any questions or comments, reach out to me, Brian at thehomesteadjourney.net. If you disagree with me on any of this, I'd love to have a dialogue with you. You can reach me again via email or on any of our social media accounts. That's it for this episode, everyone. I hope you have a great week. And until next time, keep up the good work.